When I arrived at the small family dinner, I saw 81 guests and a banner that read, "Welcome, Baby Sophie." And that was just the beginning of what they'd taken from me. I'm Joey King, 30 years old, living in San Diego. And up until last week, I thought I had finally learned how to manage the complicated relationship I had with my family. I had spent most of my 20s trying to be the responsible one, the steady one, the dependable one, even when it cost me peace, sleep, and years of financial progress. For once, things were starting to make sense. I'd just wrapped the biggest campaign of my career as a senior brand strategist at a mid-sized media firm in downtown San Diego. We turned a dying regional clothing brand into a national conversation with a single viral activation, and in our quarterly review. My boss, Angela, slid a check across the table and said, $15,000. Every dollar earned. Well done. Joey. I didn't cry, but something in my chest loosened. I had been living in a small one-bedroom apartment for 5 years, watching every dollar, budgeting for a future no one else was going to build for me. That check wasn't just money. It was permission. It meant I could finally put in an offer on a condo I'd been quietly eyeing on the east side, a place with light, quiet, and no one else's name on the lease. The next day, my mother Meredith called. Her voice was high and cheerful, a little too cheerful. She said the family wanted to do something small to celebrate my promotion, just a casual dinner with close relatives. Nothing over the top, just you, me, Randall, Sophie, and Cam, maybe Aunt Jo if she's in town. She said. I was hesitant. As always, family with my mother never really meant closeness. It meant obligation, noise, and subtle guilt. I hadn't been home in almost a year, not since Sophie, my half-sister, moved in with Cam, yes, Cam, my ex-boyfriend of 3 years. It was a betrayal that didn't even shock me at that point. Sophie had always been the golden child, the one who made mistakes that everyone rushed to excuse when I brought it up back then. My mother simply sighed and said, "Life moves on. Don't hold grudges. Joey, it's not good for your skin." I remember laughing then, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her. But still, a part of me wanted to believe that maybe this time was different. Maybe she really wanted to celebrate my success. Maybe, just maybe, someone in that house saw me not just as someone they could lean on, but as someone worth honoring. I said yes. I even offered to bring a bottle of Prosecco. And the morning of the dinner, I bought a dark green dress that hugged my waist and made me look like someone who had her life together. I left early, thinking I'd help set the table, maybe catch up with Sophie in a calm moment. I even picked up a small candle for her apartment as a peace offering, because I knew she'd been dealing with some early pregnancy symptoms. There had been whispers in the family group chat about a baby, but no one had told me directly. I assumed she was waiting for the right time. The first warning sign came when I turned into the cul-de-sac and couldn't find parking. Cars lined both sides of the street like there was a block party happening. I circled once, then parked 2 houses away on the lawn of a neighbor I didn't recognize. The second red flag came as I approached the house and heard music, not the kind of background playlist you'd expect at a family dinner, but live music, the sound of a jazz trio playing somewhere out of view. Then I saw the catering van, the servers in black and white, the glittering lights draped across the porch and down into the yard. I stopped outside the front door and checked the text my mom had sent, just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. Saturday, 6 p.m., just dinner. She'd written, no mention of a party, no mention of a baby shower, no mention of 81 guests, and a full-scale event that looked like it had been planned for weeks. I walked up the steps slowly, balancing the bottle of Prosecco in my left hand and the small gift bag in my right, trying to convince myself this was still going to be okay. Meredith opened the door like she had been waiting for me all night. "You're finally here," she said, pulling me into a tight hug that reeked of perfume and tension. "Everyone's dying to see you." I blinked. "Everyone?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just smiled and ushered me inside. I followed her past a foyer filled with coats, past an open dining room crowded with trays of food, past 3 people I'd never seen before who were laughing too hard at nothing. And then she opened the patio doors. That's when I saw it. Rows of white folding chairs facing a balloon arch. A custom dessert table covered in floral cupcakes and gold foil napkins. A photographer circling the crowd with a Canon lens I recognized from my company shoots. And stretched across 2 posts, catching the light of the setting sun. A banner in large, rose gold letters, "Welcome, baby Sophie." My name wasn't anywhere. Not on a chalkboard, not on a menu card, not in a single whispered sentence, but I was there. In every invoice they never showed me, in every dollar they quietly stole, in every thank you that wasn't meant for me. And I hadn't even realized yet just how much they'd taken. I stood still in that crowded backyard, surrounded by people raising their glasses and laughing at jokes I hadn't heard. While something in my chest began to shift, it wasn't rage, not yet. It was the realization that I was being celebrated for something I never agreed to, praised for a generosity I didn't offer, included in a moment that didn't belong to me. Sophie came over glowing, her pregnant belly just beginning to show beneath a pale pink dress that made her look like she belonged on a magazine cover. She reached out and wrapped her arms lightly around me, avoiding contact with her makeup. "Joey," she said with genuine affection, "I can't believe you did all this. Mom said it was your idea. She said you wanted to do something special for me, to make up for lost time." I blinked once. "She said I planned this." Sophie nodded without hesitation and added, "She told everyone you insisted on covering it. She said you felt guilty about being distant, and this was your way of reconnecting." Her voice carried no malice, only excitement. She believed it completely. In that moment, I saw her not as my sister, but as a mirror. She was raised to expect this. She was told that love came in the form of sacrifices other people made on her behalf. I didn't respond. I simply walked back toward the house, smiling politely at guests who nodded at me as if I were the guest of honor. Once inside, I found a quiet moment in the kitchen, stepped aside, and opened my banking app. The old account was still there, the one I had opened in college when my mother insisted on having a joint emergency fund. I'd left a small balance over the years, thinking it was harmless. I hadn't touched it in almost 3 years. I also hadn't closed it. Now I saw 15 withdrawals made within the last 7 days. 4 separate payments to a luxury catering company in La Jolla, one to a boutique event stylist, another to a tent rental service, charges for custom invitations, a photographer, a live band, and a florist I recognized from Instagram ads. I did not need a calculator. The numbers added up. Every dollar of my $15,000 bonus was gone, not a mistake, not an accident. Every transaction had a timestamp within 48 hours of my promotion announcement. I closed the app and took a slow breath. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about the story they told around it. I walked back outside, carrying this knowledge like a stone in my pocket. People continued to thank me, to compliment me on my selflessness. My uncle leaned in and said, "Not everyone would do this for their sister, especially after the history you two have. Shows a lot of growth." My aunt winked at me and whispered, Now that's what I call healing. I smiled through it all, documenting the weight of each comment. My mother floated nearby, never letting me drift too far without redirecting the narrative when it veered too close to the truth. Every interaction had been pre-managed, the language crafted, the roles assigned. I was generous. I was forgiving. I was the responsible sister who had finally come around. The role was clean and predictable, and it helped everyone feel good about what they had taken. I found Meredith near the garage, pretending to scroll through her phone, but clearly keeping tabs on who was arriving. I waited until no one else was near, then stood beside her and spoke quietly. You took my bonus, the entire $15,000, without asking. She didn't even look at me, only sighed and said, You're being dramatic. Joey, you're doing fine. This was for family. I stared at her for a second, then replied, You told people I offered. You created an entire version of me that doesn't exist. She turned to face me then, a carefully polite smile on her lips. If I had asked, you would have said no, and it would have made things awkward. Sometimes it's better to do what needs to be done and let people catch up emotionally later. Her words didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how calm I felt. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply noted it, like a journalist collecting evidence. I walked away and watched her return to her guests like nothing had happened. I didn't blow up the party. I didn't storm out. I needed them to believe they had gotten away with it, so I could see exactly how deep the betrayal ran. That night wasn't about confrontation. It was about documentation. Every guest who thanked me, every vendor who mentioned my instructions, every relative who believed I had written the checks. It all became part of the record, not for revenge, for clarity, because this time, I wasn't going to wait for the next apology that never came. I wasn't going to let them rewrite my boundaries with lies and good intentions. I was going to take back what was mine, and I was going to do it on paper. The next morning, I sent the message. It was short and direct. Without emotional dressing or attempts to soften the truth, I wrote that I had identified a series of unauthorized withdrawals from our joint account totaling $15,000, matching exactly the amount of my recent work bonus. I explained that the account had since been frozen, that I had initiated a fraud claim with the bank, and that all related access had been permanently revoked. I ended the message by stating clearly that no further financial entanglements would be permitted under any circumstances, effective immediately. I didn't ask for a response. I didn't expect one, but I got 3, each more chaotic than the last. First came the voicemail from Randall, laced with mock disappointment. He said it was a shame I was acting like this over a little financial mix-up, and that if I had concerns, I should have come home to talk it out like a real adult. He called me calculating and cold, which I suppose was meant as an insult, but honestly felt like an improvement compared to the version of me they usually preferred silent. Agreeable and conveniently available. Then came a string of texts from Meredith, jumping between faux confusion and controlled rage. She claimed she didn't realize the account was still that important to me. Then she said I was being selfish, that Sophie was carrying the first grandchild in the family and didn't deserve to have her special moment turned into some kind of legal tantrum. I read every word, not to internalize it, but to document the tone, to remind myself of what years of emotional management had looked like from their end. And then came the real crack in the performance. Around noon, I received a call from Sophie. Her voice was tight, soft, like she had been crying. She asked me if it was true, if I had really frozen the accounts and filed a complaint. I told her calmly that yes, it was true, and that the money they used was mine. She paused. Mom said you offered it. She said you wanted this to be your gift. I could hear her disbelief cracking under the weight of facts. I told her I never offered anything, that I hadn't even known about the party until I walked into the backyard. There was silence, then a slow, shaky breath. I didn't know. She said, "I'm sorry." I believed her. Sophie had been shielded from responsibility for most of her life. That wasn't entirely her fault, but believing her didn't mean I was going to fix it for her anymore. That afternoon, I sat with all the documents spread out across my dining table, bank statements, screenshots of messages, timeline summaries. I needed to get clear, not just emotionally but legally. Years ago, when Meredith and Randall faced the threat of foreclosure, I had co-signed the mortgage to help them refinance. My credit had been clean, my income steady. It had been framed as a temporary solution. I had even been listed as a co-owner on the property, something they brushed off as a formality. Now, that formality was leverage. I called Mr. Patel, a financial attorney recommended by my firm, and walked him through the situation. I explained that I wasn't trying to force anyone out of their home, but I needed to ensure this didn't happen again. He listened patiently and then said something that caught me off guard. "Joey, you've been financially responsible for people who've never had to respect your boundaries. That imbalance will keep repeating itself until there are consequences they can't ignore." He suggested filing a partition action not to sell the house outright, but to start a legal process that would signal my seriousness. I didn't need to follow through. I just needed the paperwork ready, something real enough to shift the dynamic. We agreed to draft the petition and hold it unfiled until I gave the word. Later that evening, I got another message from Meredith, this time. It was a mix of panic and pride. She said she had spoken to some people who assured her I couldn't actually take legal action without destroying the family's reputation. She called me ungrateful, said I was lucky to be part of something so meaningful as Sophie's celebration. I didn't reply. I saved the message in the same folder where I kept the rest of the evidence. There was a coldness in me now that wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I wasn't cutting them off to punish them. I was disconnecting the pipeline they had built between my labor and their entitlement. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the dynamic. I was naming it. By nightfall, I had already made up my mind. If they wanted a conversation, it would be on neutral ground, with specific terms, no manipulation, no guilt, no soft rewriting of history. I scheduled a session with Dr. Elaine, my therapist, and shared everything. She didn't seem surprised. "What you're doing," she said, "is boundary enforcement, not abandonment. And the more they scream, the more clearly you'll see who benefited from the old system." Her words stayed with me as I printed out the final draft of the petition, signed my name, and slid it into an envelope marked ready. They didn't respond in 3 days. They responded in 4. The email came from Meredith's address, but the language was clearly Randall's, a carefully worded mixture of dismissal and warning. It said they would not be signing anything, and that if I wanted to create a wedge between myself and the only family who ever supported me, then so be it. There was no apology, no recognition of harm, just the assumption that I would eventually calm down, forget the details, and return to the version of myself that kept the system working for everyone but me. I didn't reply. I simply forwarded the message to Mr. Patel and asked him to move forward with the next step. I wasn't bluffing. I was tired of being the only one who treated our shared history with any seriousness. Over the next week, the tone shifted again. The anger cooled. replaced by a strangely cheerful form of denial. Meredith sent a photo of a new wallpaper she was considering for the guest room and asked for my opinion. Randall left a voicemail inviting me to a barbecue just like old times. I didn't respond to either. I had spent so much of my life responding to things that weren't real performances of closeness. Gestures of unity that came with strings so fine you didn't notice them cutting into you until years later. This time, I was staying quiet, not out of punishment, but because there was nothing left to clarify. Everything had already been said. Sophie called the following Friday. She asked if we could meet for lunch. Just the two of us. No cameras, no expectations. I agreed, mostly because I needed to know where she stood now that the illusion had cracked. We met at a diner halfway between our apartments. She looked tired but clear-eyed. As we sipped coffee, she said she had asked our parents point blank if they had used my money without telling me. Meredith had responded with a version of the truth that sounded almost noble, like she had done it out of love, out of faith that I would understand eventually. Sophie said she had believed her at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it felt like a story meant to cover a pattern I had been living in since before she was old enough to notice. She apologized again. This time it felt different. It wasn't just regret, it was recognition. She admitted that growing up. She had seen how often I was expected to pick up the slack. I paid for school trips, replaced broken appliances, covered rent during Randall's transitions. She remembered the time Meredith used my savings for her senior prom dress and told Sophie I had offered. I hadn't, but I hadn't corrected the story either. That was my part in it. I let silence do the work because fighting always costs more. Until now. Sophie offered to pay me back, even just a small amount each month. I told her no. This wasn't her debt. She had been used too, just in a different way, but I asked her for something else instead. Truth. When the stories start spinning again, don't play along. Don't protect them out of habit. Tell the truth. Even if it's small, even if it's awkward. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I believed we might one day have a relationship not built on performance. As we parted, she hugged me carefully and whispered, "I see it now. I really do." That weekend, the legal notice was officially posted. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in forcing people into accountability. Only the quiet peace of knowing I had finally stopped folding myself into smaller shapes to avoid conflict. I spent the evening in my apartment with a cup of tea and no background noise. It was the first time in years I hadn't felt the need to check my phone every few minutes, just in case someone else's emotions required managing. On Sunday morning, I received one final message from Meredith. It read, "I hope you're proud of yourself. We may never recover from this." I stared at it for a full minute before deleting it without replying, because that was the point. I wasn't interested in helping them recover from consequences anymore. I was interested in recovering myself. After years of letting things slide, I expected some kind of internal chaos after drawing a line, but the strange thing was how quiet it became, not just in the apartment, but inside my own head. I wasn't rehearsing conversations. I wasn't preparing for damage control. And I wasn't apologizing for feelings I didn't cause. It was the kind of silence you don't notice at first because it feels unfamiliar, almost like standing in a room where a refrigerator hum has just stopped. You only realize the noise existed once it's gone. I slept better. Not longer, but deeper. I drank my coffee without my jaw clenched. Even my posture changed without me trying. I didn't understand at the time that peace isn't always something you chase. Sometimes it shows up when you stop participating in your own distortion. Around this time, I began volunteering at a local mentorship program through work. One of our clients had asked if anyone on our team could spend a few hours a week supporting young women transitioning into marketing roles. I signed up, partly because I had the time, and partly because I needed to remember that family didn't always have to mean legacy or blood. Sometimes family is built around who believes in your clarity, not just your usefulness. The first session was awkward. As expected, most of the girls were quiet at first, suspicious of someone who worked in an office with marble floors. But by the third week, something shifted. One of the girls, Leah, asked me how I managed to speak so calmly in meetings when someone disrespected my ideas. I told her the truth. You practice calm the same way you practice any muscle. You fail a lot at first. Then one day, your silence doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like control. That answer surprised even me. I hadn't realized how much I had internalized the shift. Meanwhile, the silence from Meredith and Randall was no longer passive. It had morphed into a kind of strategic detachment. They didn't reach out, didn't ask about the legal process, didn't show up at any meetings. Instead, they began using extended family as intermediaries. My uncle left a voicemail reminding me that family means forgiveness. A cousin sent me a text with a Bible verse. I didn't respond, not out of anger, but because I no longer believed in conflict as a way to prove my point. Their version of forgiveness always meant forgetting what was done, forgetting what was taken, forgetting that I had ever tried to say no. That month, I attended a client event and ran into my old college mentor, Mara. She had always been one of the few people who saw my family dynamic without trying to sugarcoat it. She asked how things were going, and when I gave her the short version, she nodded and said, "Sometimes the only apology you get is the one you give yourself." That stayed with me, not as comfort, but as confirmation. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for apologies, not for understanding, not for the moment they'd finally realize how much harm they had normalized. I was giving myself the closure they refused to offer, and it turned out that was more sustainable than I expected. The lawsuit itself was simple on paper but emotionally layered. Mr. Patel submitted clear documentation showing the misappropriation of funds and requested a formal delineation of financial boundaries. Meredith's lawyer filed a tepid counterclaim, saying there had been no intent to deceive. We didn't argue about intent. We presented evidence of action, bank transfers, group emails, project notes where I had explicitly declined participation in the event they used my money to fund. The judge requested mediation. I agreed, but only if the sessions were recorded and conducted in the presence of counsel. That was the first time Meredith looked at me across the table and realized I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even cold. I was clear. And there is nothing more destabilizing to someone who depends on your compliance than clarity they can't manipulate. After mediation, Sophie called me. She had listened to the recording, and she cried, not because it was dramatic, but because she said, for the first time, she had heard Meredith lie directly and without flinching. It hit her in a way my explanations never could. Seeing it firsthand cracked the last layer of illusion. She apologized again, but I stopped her. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about honesty. I told her, if she wanted to rebuild trust, the door was open, but it had to be with bricks we both carried, not borrowed stories, not secondhand loyalty. That night, I sat at my desk and stared at the city lights. No music, no wine, no distraction, just stillness. And I thought, this is what coming home to yourself feels like. Not triumphant, not cinematic, just honest. And for the first time, that was enough. The following week, something unexpected arrived in the mail. It was a handwritten card, ivory-colored, sealed in wax. At first glance, I assumed it was another guilt-laced message from one of my aunts. But when I opened it, I saw Meredith's handwriting. She didn't write much, just a few lines. Joey, whatever you think I did, it wasn't meant to hurt you. I hope we can still be a family. Love, M. I reread the message 3 times, each time feeling less surprised and more resigned. There it was again, the framing I had grown up with. Not denial, not apology, just a gentle recentering of her intent as the only thing that mattered. I didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. You can't negotiate with someone who still believes their intentions outrank your experience. Mr. Patel called later that day with an update. The mediation notes had been reviewed by the judge, and the case was likely to settle in our favor. That didn't mean an apology or a confession. It meant legal distance, financial clarity, a new structure. Randall had agreed, begrudgingly, to remove my name from all future shared expenses, and Meredith had accepted the terms as long as I didn't pursue reimbursement. I signed the papers without hesitation. I wasn't trying to reclaim what was already gone. I was closing the leak. For good. The following Friday, my company held a private dinner for the creative team and a few top-tier clients. It was hosted in a converted library downtown, filled with soft amber lighting and long oak tables. As I stood near the back, sipping a glass of wine, my manager pulled me aside and introduced me to someone from a major brand we had been trying to pitch for months. The woman shook my hand and said, "I've heard about your campaign for Hawthorne Books. Bold work, subtle, but powerful." I smiled, thanked her, and realized something in that moment. I hadn't thought about my family once that evening, not out of spite, not from avoidance, but because I was finally present in a space where my value didn't depend on their recognition. Later that night, while walking to my car, I passed a small flower shop with a chalkboard out front. The quote on it read, "Forgiveness isn't about accepting the wrong, it's about releasing your need to carry it." I stopped and stared at it for a while. There had been a time when I would have taken that as a cue to call Meredith, to make the first move, to bridge a gap she never acknowledged, but not now, not anymore. Forgiveness wasn't a performance. It wasn't about erasing history or pretending harm hadn't been done. It was about reclaiming the space where harm no longer got to speak louder than your peace. Sophie and I met for brunch the next morning. She looked different, lighter. Her posture had changed too, and there was something in her voice that sounded less like apology and more like choice. She told me she had started journaling everything memories, questions, realizations, and had been working through the discomfort of seeing things she wasn't ready to see before. I listened, not as an older sister who needed validation, but as someone who had once stood exactly where she was. At one point, she paused and asked me, "Do you think they know they hurt us?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "I think they know we've stopped letting it slide, and that might be enough." The final settlement confirmation came in by email the following Monday. No fanfare, no dramatic ending, just a quiet line in a PDF stating that all shared financial claims were closed. With each party moving forward independently, it should have felt underwhelming, but it didn't. It felt like the clean click of a door locking behind me, not in fear, in finality. I didn't need anyone to validate the boundary. The boundary had become self-sustaining. That evening, I walked into my apartment and noticed how much lighter it felt. The furniture hadn't changed, but the weight had. I turned on a playlist, made dinner without checking my phone, and sat down to eat without rehearsing an emotional script in my head. Somewhere between the first bite and the last, it occurred to me that healing hadn't been loud or cathartic. It had been administrative, consistent, legal, emotionally precise. The opposite of what people often picture when they imagine reclaiming their lives. But it worked. It held. As I cleaned up, I thought about the next chapter, not in the cinematic sense, but in the quiet, lived-in way of someone who has just enough clarity to stop living on alert. I wasn't healed, but I was home, and that, after everything, felt like the most radical thing of all. About 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I received a group message from Meredith. It was addressed to me, Sophie, and a few of our extended cousins. The text read, "Family dinner this Sunday at the Shoreline House. Small and casual. Just a few people to celebrate the season." I stared at the message for a full minute, then read it again, as if the subtext would somehow change. It didn't. No apology, no context. Just another invitation to participate as if nothing had ever happened. Sophie messaged me privately almost instantly, asking if I was going. I told her I hadn't decided, but the truth was I already knew. I was going, not because I wanted to reconcile or reopen anything. I just needed to see it through clear eyes. I needed to sit in that space and not feel small, not anymore. That Sunday, I pulled into the gravel driveway a few minutes early. Shoreline House still looked the same. The white shutters, the creaking porch, the hydrangeas planted in chaotic clusters near the gate. But something in me had shifted. I walked in through the side door like I used to, carrying a bottle of wine I knew they'd never open. And I was met by Meredith in the hallway. She smiled like nothing was off. "You came," she said softly, touching my arm as if we had just seen each other last week. "Of course," I replied calmly, not out of politeness, but out of completion. There was no edge in my voice, just clarity. She turned and called out, "Joey's here," and within seconds, Randall walked in, holding a tray of deviled eggs and giving me a single, unreadable nod. I gave one back. No performance, no scene, just presence. The house filled slowly with familiar faces, cousins, partners, people I hadn't seen since that chaotic baby dinner months ago. They chatted about local elections, fall recipes, sports. No one mentioned the lawsuit, the fallout, or even the obvious absence of certain friends who had chosen to stay neutral by staying away. I didn't expect acknowledgement. I had finally learned that most people aren't built to hold the weight of family conflict unless they benefit from it. What I didn't expect was Sophie. She arrived late, wearing a clean white shirt tucked into navy trousers, looking both nervous and composed. She saw me from across the room and offered a nod that didn't need translation. I moved to make room beside me at the kitchen island, and she took it without hesitation. Dinner was served buffet style: pot roast, green beans, the usual suspects. As I stood in line behind Randall, I noticed he avoided looking in my direction. I didn't mind. In fact, it was almost a relief. There was no attempt to charm, no faux warmth, just the quiet discomfort of someone who no longer held leverage. At the table, conversation drifted toward the upcoming holidays. Meredith said something about maybe doing Christmas in Tahoe again. Sophie cleared her throat. "I think this year. I'll be staying in Portland," she said with ease. "Just something quieter, more centered." Meredith blinked but didn't push. It was a subtle line in the sand, and I watched her draw it without flinching. After dinner, people slowly migrated into the living room. I stayed back to help clean up, not out of habit, but to have a moment alone in the kitchen. Sophie joined me silently, drying dishes as I rinsed them. "At one point," she said. "I didn't think you'd come," I replied. "I came because I needed to. Not for them, for me." She nodded and then whispered, "Same." That was enough. That night, I drove home in complete silence. No music, no inner arguments, no replays, just the gentle hum of closure taking shape. The next morning, I woke up and realized something had changed. Not in the world, not in them, but in me, for the first time in months. I didn't feel like I was carrying someone else's chaos. I didn't need to fix it, reframe it, or justify why it happened. I had seen it clearly, stood inside of it calmly, and walked out with my voice still intact. And that, I realized, was the quietest kind of freedom there is. The week after that dinner, I cleared out the guest room closet. It had been full of things I hadn't touched in over a year: holiday linens, unused gifts, paperwork I kept out of guilt. I packed the boxes methodically, not in haste, but with quiet decisiveness. As I taped the last one shut, I realized how long I had allowed my living space to reflect someone else's expectations. Everything about that closet, that room, even that hallway, had been shaped by the belief that one day someone from that side of the family might visit, might sleep over, might stay. That belief had lingered like an echo, even when their actions had long proven otherwise. Now, it felt like shedding a coat that no longer fit. I wasn't angry, just done. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the editor of an online publication I used to contribute to. They were reviving a section on family systems and resilience, and she asked if I'd be willing to submit something personal. It felt like the kind of opportunity I would have overthought in the past, maybe even declined out of fear of appearing too exposed. But now, I knew I had a story that wasn't about drama. It was about endurance. So I said yes. I didn't name names or rehash every incident. Instead, I wrote about what happens when loyalty is expected without reciprocity, and what it means to choose yourself without apology. I sent the piece before I could edit the honesty out of it, and 2 weeks later, it was live. The feedback was quiet but steady messages from strangers, short and soft, like "thank you" or "I felt this too," and that was enough. Meanwhile, Sophie was changing too. She called me one night and said she'd finally set a boundary with Meredith over a family loan. Meredith had asked her to co-sign something for Randall, and Sophie had declined. No big speech, just a simple no. I didn't explain. She said quietly, I didn't justify, and I didn't feel guilty afterward. I smiled and told her that was what healing looks like. Not dramatic declarations, just new behavior, sustained. She laughed and said, "Who knew peace was this quiet?" We both laughed then. It was the first time I had heard her sound light in months. A few days later, I was walking home from the grocery store when I passed by a cafe I hadn't noticed before. The windows were fogged from the rain, and inside, I saw a mother helping her daughter with homework over a cup of hot cocoa. It was such a small scene, but it brought me to a full stop. I realized, in that moment, how much time I had spent chasing family through obligations and events, instead of moments like that, small, safe, shared. I didn't want fanfare or reconciliation or grand gestures anymore. I wanted presence. I wanted to be with people who met me where I stood, not where they needed me to stay. And that shift, subtle as it was, redefined what I considered family. A week after that, Randall sent a group email about organizing a summer cabin weekend. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because it wasn't mine to carry anymore. Sophie messaged me. "I'm not going either," I replied. "Good. Let's go somewhere else, just us." She sent a thumbs up emoji, followed by a beach photo. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just new, a new pattern, a new rhythm, a new loyalty we were building without asking permission. The old roles had crumbled quietly, not in some climactic confrontation, but in daily decisions that no longer centered people who had shown us they couldn't hold our worth. By the end of that month, I had deleted the shared calendar Meredith had added me to years ago. I stopped tracking birthdays I wasn't invited to. I unsubscribed from the newsletter Randall's wife sent about their baby's milestones. None of it was done in anger. I just finally understood that participation isn't proof of love. Sometimes it's just residue, and when that residue builds up, you start mistaking weight for meaning. So I chose lightness, not escape, not detachment, just lightness. And in that lightness, I found room for things I didn't even know I missed, like Sunday mornings without tension, or sitting in my own living room without feeling the pressure to be ready for guests who never came. And that, more than any victory or comeback, felt like the win. I didn't expect to see Meredith again so soon, but the universe rarely checks our calendars. It was a Tuesday, mid-afternoon, and I was in the Co-op bakery downtown, buying sourdough and herbal tea. She was at the counter ahead of me, dressed like she always had been, polished, effortless, slightly too loud for the quiet room. She turned and saw me. Her face froze for a half second. Then she smiled, like we'd just bumped into each other at a cousin's barbecue. I didn't flinch. I said hello and waited. She glanced at my basket, then asked if I wanted to join her at the cafe side for 5 minutes. I agreed, not because I wanted to reconnect, but because I had no reason to avoid it anymore. That was the difference. I wasn't curious. I wasn't angry. I was just open. We sat at a small table by the window, and she launched into baby updates. Work stress, a half apology masked as small talk. "I know that dinner kind of spiraled," she said, fiddling with the straw in her cup. "It wasn't supposed to get that big. You know how Randall is." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her and let the silence stretch. And when I finally spoke, I said something simple and unremarkable. "I don't think I'll be joining things like that anymore." No accusation, no list of receipts, just a line, a clear one. Her smile flickered for a second, like it couldn't quite decide what to do. She asked if I was mad, and I said no. And it was true. I wasn't. But I also wasn't interested in pretending that anything about that night or the years before, it had been fine. That was the first time I noticed how unsettling peace could be for people who relied on your chaos to center themselves. Meredith looked confused by my calm. She kept glancing down at her phone, waiting for me to fill the space like I always had. But I didn't. Eventually, she stood, said she had to get going, and added something like, "We should do this again sometime." I nodded but made no promise. She left before her cup was empty. I stayed and finished my tea. Later that week, Sophie and I met for dinner at our favorite spot on the east side. It was quiet and dim, the kind of place you go when you want to be heard without raising your voice. She told me she'd started therapy again, and that her therapist asked when she'd last felt truly safe in her own family. I couldn't answer, she admitted. But I didn't cry. That surprised me. I told her maybe that's because grief is what you feel when you still hope. And maybe now. She'd stopped hoping for things that would never come. She looked at me and nodded slowly, as if something settled into place she hadn't known was loose. Then we both ordered dessert, something we used to skip because we felt too full or too guilty or too careful. Not anymore. That night, we sat there for hours, talking about things that didn't revolve around family problems. We talked about travel, about work, about a friend of hers who'd just adopted a dog that hated everyone but liked jazz. And I remember thinking that maybe healing wasn't something you arrived at in one big dramatic moment. Maybe it was just a quiet room, a safe face across the table, and no one checking their phone, waiting for someone more important to walk in. A few days later, the editor who'd published my essay asked if I wanted to contribute again this time, something longer, more reflective. I said yes, and as I wrote, I realized I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't writing to be understood by the people who'd erased me. I was writing for the people who were still piecing themselves back together quietly, steadily, without fanfare. People like me, people like Sophie, people who never threw the first punch, but always ended up patching their own wounds. The story went live and did better than any of us expected. I started getting invitations to speak on panels, to contribute to workshops, to teach small classes about narrative healing, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into each room knowing exactly what I brought, not bitterness, not perfection, just clarity. That was the real shift. The old version of me would have sent Meredith a link, would have hoped she read it. This version didn't even consider it, and in that absence of seeking, I found presence. I wasn't trying to circle back anymore. I was walking forward. I never replied to their final message. I didn't delete it either. I left it sitting there, not as a wound, but as a reminder that everything really did happen, and I survived it without waiting for apologies that were never meant to heal anything. That morning, I woke up early, brewed my coffee, opened the window to let in some fresh air, and started writing thank you notes to the partners who had supported my work. I didn't mention the betrayal. I didn't talk about the pain. I simply wrote with sincerity and gratitude because, for once, I was building something where I didn't have to constantly prove I belonged in that quiet moment. I realized peace doesn't always mean the absence of noise. Sometimes, peace is just standing inside the storm and realizing you no longer need shelter. A week later, I was invited to speak to a small class of students studying personal branding and storytelling. I told them the truth. No aliases, no edits. I explained how I was once the person everyone came to when they needed a fix, but no one stood by when things got uncomfortable. I told them how I was called difficult to manage when I asked for clarity, how I was labeled ungrateful for wanting fairness, and how the event I funded turned into a stage where I wasn't even welcome. The room went silent, not because the story was tragic, but because many of them had lived their own versions of it. Afterward, a young woman came up to me, her eyes glassy. She said, "I've never heard anyone tell a story like that without sounding bitter." I just smiled, because not long ago, I wouldn't have believed it was possible either. I didn't retaliate. I didn't post anything online. I didn't block anyone. I simply changed the locks, revoked access to the accounts I'd once shared, and removed their names from the documents that mattered, slowly. People stopped calling me emotional. They started calling me professional, and because I had made peace without pretending, it never hurt. I started receiving invitations to consult on branding for women who had been erased, sidelined, or silenced. Not because I had made it big, but because I had refused to disappear. Sometimes I pass by the neighborhood where that party took place. I don't avoid it. I don't look for familiar faces either, if I saw one. I'd probably just nod and keep walking, because at this point, I don't carry a script anymore. I show up as myself. And I've learned that no one else has the right to rewrite your story, even if they helped build the first chapter. I don't need anyone's understanding. What I needed was to understand myself, and I do now, more clearly than ever. Sophie kept in touch. We don't rehash the details often, but there's a kind of quiet understanding between us now. No guilt, no explanations, just the shared recognition that we both walked through the fire and came back without burning each other. Recently, she sent me an article she wrote, inspired by a coffee conversation we had last month. I didn't change a word. I saw she was finally finding her own voice, and that was enough for me. I don't know if the future will be big or small, loud or quiet, but I know I'll never again build a home where I'm not allowed to stay. I no longer crave applause from rooms where I'm asked to shrink. I crave sunlight, truth, and a version of success that doesn't require me to hide the parts that made me whole. I know there are still people out there being dismissed, devalued, or told they're too much for simply asking for respect. And if this story finds its way to even one of them, then every word was worth it. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not a story about winning. It's about staying present when people try to erase you, about staying true when you're told to tone it down, and most of all, about staying kind when bitterness would be easier. I didn't win anything. I just didn't leave. And sometimes, that's what changes everything, not because you proved them wrong, but because you stopped needing to. So now, I'll ask you something. If the day ever comes when someone tries to write you out of your own story, will you hand them the pen, or will you pick it back up and begin again on your own terms?